Okay, imagine this. You've got one player on the PGA Tour who has 2 wins this season, including one of those wins coming at an elevated event against, of course, a very difficult field. And this player also finished in the top 10 at the Tour Championship. Yet, he's not on the Ryder Cup team. Of course, we're talking about Keegan Bradley, and I gotta wonder, was he intentionally snubbed? What was the reason that he was left off of the Ryder Cup team in the captain's pick by Zach Johnson? So we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about his reaction here in just a second. You can clearly tell there's some frustration from Keegan Bradley there. But ultimately, there was just no way that Zach Johnson was going to come out of this completely unscathed. There's just way too many options and too much talent for him to pick from. No matter who he left off this team, you could potentially make a case. However, if you look at the tail of the tape, this one is really difficult to justify. So running through some of the other captain's picks, of course, you had Brooks Koepka. I don't think there was any type of surprise there. Koepka, and one thing we talked about here on the podcast before is he really only needed to play like one PGA Tour event and he would have qualified automatically for points. That's how many points he racked up in the majors this year. Being on LIV, he doesn't rack up any points. Sam Burns, I think, is going to be an excellent pick as well. Remember, he won the WGC match play, which was, included wins over, guys like Scotty Scheffler and Cameron Young, who was another potential here, but Sam had bested him at that match play. So again, another great pick there. Fowler was an interesting pick too. And I don't think there's anyone who's unhappy with seeing Rickie Fowler on the team. He's a guy who it's impossible to root against. And he had a major comeback season, including one win. But that win came at the Rocket Mortgage Classic. And remember, if we're just comparing one to the other, Keegan Bradley had 2 wins on the PGA Tour, and one came at one of those designated or elevated events with a much more difficult field. Morikawa, Colin Morikawa, another pick, no wins this season. However, just going back 18 months ago, he was more or less Mr. Consistent, untouchable in a lot of ways. So that I would imagine would be Zach Johnson's thinking there. And then Jordan Spieth, no wins this season. Again, finished 27th out of 30 at the Tour Championship. Spieth, again, was a name that was on everybody's tongue about who was going to be a potential Ryder Cup pick. So again, nothing too shocking there. I think the most shocking comes in with Justin Thomas. So Justin Thomas was added to the team. I think we all know, and we've talked about it here on the podcast enough, how tough of a season Justin has had. No one, I think, has been more frustrated with it than Justin Thomas himself. He's expressed that frustration in interviews before. He's expressed it on social media. We all know he's struggling. He didn't even make it to the FedEx Cup playoffs. As hard as he tried to, he didn't make it to the FedEx Cup playoffs. So I think that would be the number one most shocking thing of having ultimately a scenario where we put Justin Thomas on the team, but not Keegan Bradley. Now, let's quickly talk about Keegan's reaction. Keegan got a quick interview right after the captain's picks came out, and he said, "I could tell by the response from Zach when I answered the phone that I wasn't on the team. I'm super bummed out. I thought I put together a really good year with 2 wins, including in Hartford over an elite field. I'm proud of what I've done." He mentions JT here. He says, "I think JT is generational talent. I've always been," here's the most important thing. I mean, keep coming back to this. "I've always been an outsider in the sport, but I've tried to get closer to the guys I thought would be on the team. I feel like moving forward, I'm going to have to automatically qualify for the Ryder Cup team." And then he says, "I'm pulling for the U.S. team to win." But that's the words I think that stung home so hard. He said, in order for him to make it, he's going to have to automatically qualify. He's basically saying, because of my outsider status, I cannot rely on being a captain's pick. And that has me really wondering and thinking, what is the true differentiator here? Like, do you have to be one of this circle of friends in order to make that team. Now, I know Zach Johnson in his press conference talked about one of the biggest factors that he weighed into his picks was the cohesiveness and the matchups and who he was going to match together. But I cannot necessarily put that as a check against Keegan Bradley. I think Keegan is a guy who can be matched with other guys. I'm thinking, first of all, Keegan Bradley has that very, very not too dissimilar from Brooks Koepka. He has that kind of a little bit of a lone wolf, intense, deeply competitive personality that honestly I think would have been an excellent pairing with Brooks Koepka. Can you imagine those two on a team? I could see that working out perfectly. So there too, I can't say that that's a knock against Keegan Bradley. On top of that, if you were to look at it from an experience standpoint and say, sure, Justin Thomas has an incredible international team event record. He's got a lot of history there. He's got a lot of experience. But it's not that Keegan has no experience. You know, Keegan played on Ryder Cup teams before. I still remember him paired up with Phil Mickelson and some of the fantastic things that they did together. So if you're really driving at the idea that this is based on matchups and team chemistry, well, you know, although he's admittedly not super close, he considers himself a little bit of an outsider with some of the other guys on the team. I also don't see him as being one of those guys who, as we've seen with guys like Patrick Reed in the past, can be divisive enough that you could see I'm having trouble pairing this guy because he doesn't have a lot of friends out there. Keegan is not that type of guy. He's not a guy who's particularly friendly with them, but he's also not a guy who puts anyone off. So I'm having a lot of trouble understanding why he would be ultimately left off the team. And look, anyone can have a bad season. Take a look at Justin Thomas. He had undoubtedly a really tough year, but we know he'll bounce back. Justin Thomas has a lot of great golf ahead of him, and some have even said putting him on the Ryder Cup team would be that catalyst that he needs to get better. But on the same token, does the U.S. Ryder Cup team owe that to him to give him a spot to turn his game around, or is it owed to him just because of his past performance or how he's played in the past? It's tough to say. But if you look at on paper and you think in a Ryder Cup year, you've got one guy who had perhaps his worst season to date and another guy who's had one of his best seasons in a long time, a multiple win season, accrued more Ryder Cup points, and finished in the top 10 in the Tour Championship, proving that his form is there, he's ready to go, and has Ryder Cup experience. If you look at that on paper, it's very hard to see why Keegan Bradley won't be headed to Italy this year. It's very difficult to look at. And ultimately, like I said, isn't that one of the consequences of having one of your bad seasons happen in a Ryder Cup year, is that unfortunately you missed the Ryder Cup that year? I think ultimately if Zach Johnson had decided to go with a guy like Keegan and bench a guy like Justin Thomas, I don't think you'd be getting as much of an adverse reaction from fans, viewers, etc., because ultimately it's not hard to make the case with the way that JT's been playing over the last 12 months that he could lose his spot this year. To me, it's harder to make the case against a guy like Keegan Bradley with the season that he's had. But ultimately, the comments are open. Let us know your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. We'll be covering this more as we get closer to the Ryder Cup here on the podcast, but had to initially just take a look at this and react to it because it is really tough to see why he was left off. And ultimately got to understand the frustration that he so politely voiced in his interview the other day when Keegan talked about a bit of his frustration. So make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Stay tuned in. Like I said, we'll have a lot more coverage as we get closer to the Ryder Cup.